So side-by-side is a feature that was introduced in DBXL 2.4, and it's included in later versions. And the forms that use this feature stand alone because they don't have a SharePoint mapping. So these forms live in SharePoint. The InfoPath form submits to DBXL, and the InfoPath form also submits to SharePoint. So there's no mapping from DBXL to SharePoint. The mapping is actually from InfoPath to SharePoint. This scenario involves very intricate form changes. So that's why Qdabra creates the side-by-side template part. You add the XTP into your form. The XTP verifies the following. Verifies that your form is not out of date. So it verifies that this is the correct version of your form. It verifies whether the form is locked or whether it's being edited by another user. And it retrieves the necessary DBXL information like the doc ID, like I've been mentioning. So the purpose of this training module is to add this side-by-side template part to your form, and you'll see how quick it is to get this scenario set up using the XTP. Okay, so the caveat here is, let's say that for some reason you don't want to use the XTP. Is this scenario still possible? It is. It's just a little bit more difficult to set up, and it would be too long for a training module such as this one. But if for some reason you cannot include the XTP in your form, then contact Qdabra support, and we can help you out. So let me start off by, so this is the Qdabra DBXL side-by-side XTP. I want to start off by going to my InfoPath designer, and I'm just gonna open whatever form. I don't really have a purpose here at the moment. I don't have a design purpose. My only purpose here is to show you how to add template parts to your InfoPath designer. So let me just remove these because these are from previous work. So we have this custom controls task pane, and you have a link called add or remove custom controls, and you simply select add a template part, and it's right on my desktop. Here it is, side by side. So then this template part becomes sort of a control, right? It's right here in your controls task pane. So that means that going forward, whenever I open the InfoPath designer, this template part is going to be there. So I want to save this form because this form is not what I'm going to be working with. I'm going to take the original form. I need to find that from the website, so bear with me for 1 second here. It's right here, starting form. So I'm just going to take the starting form. Like I said, this is sort of an independent scenario, not connected to the previous training modules. Okay, and I'm going to open that in design mode. And you'll see that if I go to the submit button is set up to send email. So that's what tells me that this is the original, the one that ships with InfoPath. So I'm going to load my controls task pane, and I'm going to just insert some space here at the bottom so that I can add my side-by-side XTP. And it comes with its submit button, it comes with a close button, and if I select Manage Rules, you'll see that the Close button unlocks the document and then closes the form. The Submit button has some conditions. The first condition is the button will be disabled if there is a newer version of the form, and the Submit button will be disabled if the form is locked by a different user. If neither of those disable the Submit button, then these are the actions that take place. The form gets submitted, and then we'll report success. But this is disabled. We should disable this because we're working with a browser form. And then we close the form. So this is what I mean by keeping it really simple for the user, right? The users see a Submit button and see a Close button. And they might see a message saying a newer version of the form exists on the server. You will not be able to submit your changes. Open the form from its original location, make your changes, and submit again. Or you might see this form is currently opened by, and it'll fill in a username right here. You will not be able to submit your changes. So it's handling for the version conflict scenario, and it's handling for the locking scenario. So it's providing some nice guidance messages for your user. So it looks pretty simple, but I want to point out that the side-by-side XDP, adding the XDP adds these three groups. So it adds a lot of DBXL metadata, doc type name. It adds a submit key, a submitted by. It adds some form logic nodes, and it adds some actions. And this is what we intend to go through in today's module. Besides adding all of these nodes that we'll be briefly modifying, it also adds these data connections. So it adds a data connection to lock the document. It adds a data connection to unlock, of course. It adds a data connection for get my info because it needs to detect who the current user is. And it adds a data connection called query document. So query document with key is basically the data connection that goes into DBXL and detects whether there's a newer version of the form, whether we're editing the correct version, etc. Now you'll notice that the four of these are temporarily pointed to http://localhost. And that might cause you some worry because your site is probably not called localhost. That's okay. I'll show you a trick. Just come here and you save your form, and I'll just save it as expense report side-by-side. And I'm going to go to DAT and create a new configuration, and I'll call it expense report side-by-side. And I'll attach that form template, and I'll save it. So I have, this is the original starting form that I downloaded from the website. I no longer need that. And I have my expense report side-by-side that I just attached to DAT. And guess what? You no longer need that. Because what we're going to do is we're going to download this from the server. Once we download it from the server, you'll see that the data connections are all fixed up. See how the web service URL changed to training.formsboard.com. So DBXL detects that these are pointing to the wrong Qdabra web service folder, and it just fixes them up. And this is valid for any data connection that queries the Qdabra web service. As soon as you put it on a different server, it's going to repoint that to the correct location. I'm going to remove the submit via email data connection, and I'm going to, yeah, those email submit options are turned off, and I'm going to submit this other button because we're not going to be using that at all. So now we're going to make some modifications manually. And why do we have to make manual modifications? Didn't we just add the XTP with all the good stuff? Well, XTPs are helpful, but they are not magical. They're not magic wands. They are going to bring in a lot of the functionality, a lot of the rules that you need, but they're not going to bring in 100% of what you need. So for example, an XTP cannot have submit data connections. It cannot have rules that execute on load. So the steps that we're going to go through now are going to set up the submit data connections. They're going to set up the form load rules. Since we could not bring those in via the XTP. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create a data connection that submits to DBXL. You'll see that the form doesn't have one. Okay, so even though the submit button is there and it contains a bunch of rules, it doesn't have a rule to actually execute a data connection because there's no data connection. So we need to add the data connection, and then we need to add it to the actions in the form. So let me create a new data connection that submits to DBXL. We know what this URL is. We've been using it all week. This is very similar to day one when we created a submit data connection, except that in day one we used a submit document operation. And in this case, we're not using submit document. We're using submit document with key. So I'll let this load, and submit document with key is right here. And then I get to my parameter screen, and I need to go fill this out. So XML, the XML parameter, as we saw earlier this week, is the entire form. The document type, and I might have mentioned this earlier in the week during a question and answer section, or during the module itself, I don't remember, but the document type is usually not declared in 95% of the data connections that you create. However, in this scenario, we have to declare the document type. So we've hit one of the scenarios where the document type has to be declared. And the SidebySide XTP brought in a node where we can store the doc type name. So we just have to point our parameter to that node. Let me resize these so they're a little easier. Yeah. The key, and this is the difference between submit document and submit document with key. When we call submit document with key, we are required to have a unique value provided for this parameter. If the key already exists in DBXL, you're going to overwrite whatever document is already in DBXL. So the key is the most important parameter you're setting here. If you get this wrong, if it's not unique, you're going to get into overwriting issues. Again, the DBXL SidebySide XTP brought in a node that has a submit key. So we just point it to that node. We're going to be defining that submit key soon. We're just pointing the data connection right now. Along with providing a key, we have to provide a client date time. And what the SidebySide XTP has for this is a attribute called submitted. So this is going to contain a timestamp. And then we get to the three parameters that we saw on Monday: name, author, and description. And what we've done with the DBXL SidebySide XTP is we have this metadata group. And the metadata group has a name. That's pretty easy. It has a author. and it has a description. So why are we so careful with defining these and keeping a key and keeping a timestamp? And it's because of the side-by-side scenario. The side-by-side scenario requires that we're very careful about which document we're editing, which document we're blocking, etc. So that's why this is a little bit more intricate than on regular submit data connection. So I'll call this DBXL Submit. And since I'm doing a browser form, I'm actually going to pause for a moment and just go turn off a lot of these features that we're not going to be using in the browser form. Okay, that looks good. So we'll go back to data connections, and you might be thinking to yourself, well, you added a DBXL Submit data connection, but you haven't added a SharePoint. There's no SharePoint data connection to submit to, right? So we need to check our SharePoint site to find out where it is we're submitting. So I have a lot of libraries, but I don't think I have one for this lab. So I'll call this library, form library, DBXL SidebySide. Okay. So this gives me a place where I can map into. And you can think about how this contrasts with the SharePoint mapping, right? The SharePoint mapping in DBX, it's managed by DBXL. So even if you try to map to a URL that doesn't exist, to a form library that doesn't exist, DBXL goes out and creates that form library. But in this scenario, the SharePoint and the DBXL site are independent, so we have to have this library pre-created. So the URL for the document library is pretty straightforward. We need to define the file name, the form name, and the form name is going to be defined right here, SP form name, SharePoint form name, and we're going to allow overwrites, of course. And I will call this I will give this a name when I get to the screen. Okay, SharePoint library submit is fine. So now I have my two submit data connections, and I can start to see how this is taking shape. Now, there's a section in the training module that I'm going to skip, and that section is completely optional. You'll see that these data connections have underscore DBXL SidebySide, underscore DBXL SidebySide, in all of them, all four of them. So that section is going to guide you in case you want to clean this up and remove the name. That's completely optional. It's just completely trivial. So if we don't do that, this result here is not going to change. So I'm just going to leave them the way they are. So now that we have our XTP injected and we have our two data connections, we need to build on the form logic and the rules that are going to enable this side-by-side scenario. So I'm going to expand this rules section quite a bit just so we can get some good real estate here on the right. So we first go to form load. And you see that there's nothing happening on form load because XTPs cannot bring in rules that execute on load. Those are not allowed in XTPs. So let's add some. Let's click New Action. And the action is going to be to set the value of this node called called finished loading. Why are we doing this? Well, sorry, I'm typing here. There. So we give it a good name. Trigger finished loading rules. Okay. So why are we doing this? The reason we are doing this is because XTPs cannot bring in form load rules. So what we've done is we've put all those form load rules on the finished loading node. So all of the rules that would normally go on form load are actually here on the finished loading node. But we need to trigger them in some way. So the way we trigger them is by creating this dummy rule on load that just triggers them, just sets the value of the field to 1. So it's a neat InfoPath trick, especially when we're working with XTPs, so that you don't have to recreate all of these rules in every form that you modify. That's just not a smart way or an efficient way of designing forms. So ask me if you didn't understand this, but the gist of it is it's a trick. We're tricking InfoPath. InfoPath doesn't let us bring in form load rules through the XTP. That's fine. So we're going to put them on this other node, finished loading, and then through form load, we just trigger them. We just flip a switch that triggers those rules. All it is a design trick. You'll remember that we defined our data connection with a doc type name. So we need to provide a doc type name in this node. So let's go back and remember our doc type name, and we'll just add it as the default value here. So that's done. Within our actions section, we have a bunch of nodes, and each node contains rules. If you go through, you're going to see a lot of rules and a lot of actions in here. Why do we do this? It's again a design trick, and the reason is, let's say that there are 3 places in your form when you might be executing lock document. So you could try to lock a document on load, and you try to lock a document right before the submit, for example. Instead of recreating those rules in every button or in every control that is going to execute those rules, you just create this dummy node. This node doesn't show up on the canvas, right? And this node gets assigned a set of rules. So anytime you need to lock document, all you do is flip this switch. You basically set lock document equal to 1. See how the first action here is stop if 0. So this switch is actually turned off because lock document is equal to 0, so we stop. We don't do anything. And then at the very end of all of these actions, so let me go to unlock document. So for unlock document, you'll see that the very last action is always clear. So we always clear it back to 0. So I could call lock document from here if I wanted to, from recipient name. I could say action, set a field's value, and then set the field of lock document to 1. And that executes all my lock document rules. So it's a trick so that you don't have to keep recreating your rules over and over again in different places in your form. You just put them in here, and you group them by action, right? So one action is submit, one action is set online state. So it just checks whether the user is offline or online, a verified version, lock document, unlock document, etc. So there's a lot of actions here. The action that we would first want to look at is submit, DBXL Submit. DBXL Submit, again, you'll notice that it stops if 0, and then it clears action at the end. So those are the 2 common steps for all of these rules. So what this rule does is that it sets the metadata, metadata being the name, the author, and the description. It sets the doc ID. It increments the form version, so it increases the form version by 1. It sets the submitted date time equal to now. It submits to SharePoint, and then at the end it unlocks the document. So it goes through all these actions. The action that we're missing is actually submitting to DBXL. You see there's a submit to SharePoint action right here, but we're missing the DBXL submit action. So what we're going to do is we're going to add that. So we'll say new action. We'll call this submit to DBXL. And this is submit data, DBXL submit. Now, one very important thing here is that the DBXL submit is happening before I submit to SharePoint. And you'll understand why in a few minutes when we get deeper into this scenario. So what we're doing is we're adding that submit data connection because, again, the XTP doesn't allow us to bring in that data connection, that setting. So we're doing the same thing again, but for this node right here called DBXL pre-submit for doc ID. And you'll see there's an action here called submit to DBXL, and it says edit. So it's calling your attention, saying, you know, please edit me. So we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to submit that data, but we want that to execute before all of these. There we go. So we've edited it, so I'll do that. Okay, so we've modified the DBXL submit action. We've modified the DBXL pre-submit for doc ID action. Those two rules are similar, but they're not the same. You'll see that they have different different actions, different rules. How are they similar? They are similar because they both submit to DBXL. How are they different? They are different because this one, DBXL pre-submit for doc ID, this action actually submits to DBXL, and its goal is to generate a doc ID for a new document. So that's the goal here, is we're just submitting to DBXL. So you see how it says stop if doc ID already obtained. So it's saying, look, the doc ID already exists, so I don't need to do this. So this doesn't happen for an existing form. Okay? So once the doc ID is known, then this rule is no longer used by the form. Okay. So besides submitting to DBXL, we have to submit to SharePoint. So you'll see there's an SP submit node. And again, it doesn't have a submit data connection because the InfoPath form template didn't allow us to bring that in. So we're going to add it. This is a pretty simple rule, right? Because it's just submit to SharePoint. And all this does is that it submits to the SharePoint library. And again, we have this commonality here. It stops if 0, and then it clears action at the end. So every one of these rules is sandwiched by these start and stop, start and clear. Okay. So we've got the DBXL submit, both two DBXL submits, and we've got our SharePoint submit. There are other intricacies, right, in which we need to determine whether the user is online or offline. And by that we mean offline or online as it refers to DBXL. So whether the user is opening a form that is created by DBXL, or whether the user is creating a form that is opening a form that is that has no DBXL information yet. So that's what we mean by offline and offline. So we have a set online state here. That's what we're going to deal with. And again, we have this stop if 0 and clear at the end. So all we have to worry about are these two in the middle. The first one is called set is offline. So we have this long formula. So what we've done here to make it a little, another InfoPath trick is this function right here. This is a function. We can't bring that in. We can't bring that in via the XCP. So we leave it here as a value, and then all we ask you to do is to move it over to the function section, to the formula section. What this does is that it checks whether there is a Qdabra DBXL processing instruction. And then it flips it to be so it becomes a Boolean, and then it counts, right? So it's either going to be a 1 or it's going to be a 0. It's going to be a 1 if there's a DBXL processing instruction. It's going to be a 0 if there's not. So that's all we're doing. Is offline is just a 1-0 field, a Boolean field, and it's just set whether, depending on whether the form has a DBXL processing instruction or not. And then we have the second action called double check using href value. So what are we doing? We're checking again, right? We have set is offline here, but then we're double checking. We're just making sure that there is no DBXL processing instruction. And it's the same thing. This is a formula. We can't bring that in as a formula in the XTP, so we just copy it here, cut it here, and then we paste it here. And this is a little bit more of a elaborated formula, but the gist of it is we are checking whether, see how this says processing instruction right here. It checks whether there's a link to DBXL. Okay. So it's just a double check to make sure that the result obtained here matches. It's you'll see that the condition here is indicating exactly that. This second one is only going to execute when the first one can't find the processing instruction. So let me save. So I've made a lot of changes. And the next step is to publish the form and try it out. But I want to take a step back and try to explain how this is all working, right? Now that we finished, I want to explain how this is all working. When the user clicks submit, this is what's happening, right? Perform submit action. And you see that all we're doing is we're setting the value of the submit field to 1. So it's a switch. It's a flip. We're flipping a switch. And this is it right here, submit. So it says set state. And it sets the state, which you can also call status. It sets it to submitted. And then it performs the DBXL submit. Okay. So this is the DBXL submit. It sets the user metadata. It sets the doc ID. It increments the form version. It sets the date time. It submits the DBXL, submits to SharePoint, and unlocks the document. Okay, now the trick here is that this set form ID, doc ID, is the rule that checks whether there is a doc ID present, right? You'll remember that we had this second DBXL submit. So it checks if there's a DBXL ID present. If there's no DBXL ID present, then it submits right here. So the form is trying to check whether it exists in DBXL. And if it doesn't exist in DBXL, it's going to go submit to DBXL, and it's going to get back the doc ID and say, okay, this is my doc ID in DBXL. And once it has that, then it can go through and set up everything else that it needs and then perform the final submits and close. So that's the idea here, is that we have to have rules that make sure that every submit that we're performing has a doc ID. And if for some reason our form doesn't have a doc ID, these are the rules that are going out, and they're going out to DBXL and they're checking that. And if there's no DBXL ID, they're gonna either generate a new one, or they're gonna either they're gonna find the one that's already there, or they're gonna generate a new one. So those are the only two paths. So we try to handle that scenario in a graceful way. Let me publish this. We publish this to the form library, because that's one of the details here, is that the your DBXL is not publishing the form to SharePoint. You have to publish the form to SharePoint. And that's only required because this is side-by-side. This is not required in any other scenario. Well, maybe if you have custom code and you're in a browser form or some more complex scenario. So I'm publishing this to a form library. I already have my form library, so I'm just going to update it. And yeah, let's add some promoted properties here. Form ID is the actual doc ID, so let's add that. And let's add form version. And we could add more, but I think I just want to publish a couple, just add a couple here. So I'll let that publish to SharePoint. This is just the normal publishing wizard. Okay, so it's published. As I've said, DBXL doesn't know yet about the existence of this form, so we have to attach it to DBXL as well. So let's just attach that and save. Okay. Next step is to verify that we have done everything correctly. The solution is working as we expect. So we will click Add Document in the form library. And I want to put an underline on that. I'm opening a document from the form library. If you open the form from DBXL and you submit to SharePoint, you're going to start running into some interesting scenarios. I mean, not say errors, but let me say some interesting scenarios. Basically, what's going to happen is that DBXL and SharePoint are going to fall out of sync. Remember that you have two separate XMLs. One is in SharePoint and one is in DBXL. And this scenario, the number one assumption in this scenario is that your users are SharePoint users, and they're not going to be interacting with the DBXL administration tool. They're just interacting with SharePoint. They're opening the form from SharePoint. They're submitting through that form. They're not going into DBXL and opening the form from DBXL. If there's a need for that, then you're going to start running into version conflicts. So let me fill out this form. think that's good enough for now. I'll submit. Okay, so there's my form. You'll see it has a form ID of 264. So that's my doc ID. If I go to DBXL, I'm going to see that my doc ID is 264. Great. You'll see that my name here matches my name here. This is incredibly important. The XTP is taking care of making sure that the names match. And there's another important thing here that I want to point out, that if you understood the scenario that's happening here with submit and submit for doc ID and all that, if you understood that scenario, then this is not going to be much of a surprise. The form version number is 2. It's not version 1. So why is it version 2 and not version 1, since I just submitted, I just created this new? The reason it's not version 1, it's because, remember, we submit to DBXL, we get the doc ID back, right? That's the key. We're getting the doc ID back. And then we can submit to DBXL, we can submit to SharePoint once we have that doc ID. So if we don't have the doc ID, this scenario fails. And you're going to start creating duplicates, and you're going to start getting your versions out of sync. So the key is this first submit is actually a double submit. The first submit takes care of creating the doc ID and pulling it back in, and then if I modify the form now, so if I modify the form now and I submit, it's going to go to version 3 because it no longer needs to submit to get the doc ID. So the second edit that I performed, the form has been designed in a way that it can detect that the doc ID is there already, and it says, okay, the doc ID is there, so I can just submit once, and the version number increases to 3 here, and the version number increases to 3 here. And that's really the most important lesson to be learned here, is that when designing this scenario, you have to make sure that DBXL and SharePoint are staying in sync. You know, there's the DBXL doc ID, there's the DBXL doc ID. The form version here is 3, the form version here is 3. This is the name in DBXL, same name in SharePoint, minus the encoding that SharePoint forces upon us, but it's the same format. So that's really the key in SidebySide, is to make sure that this form is doing all of the work. So if you wanted to compare the integrated scenario, which we discussed earlier, which is this other doc type that we were working with, this original expense report. Right here, DBXL is doing the work, right? It's the web service that's handling this mapping. It's the web service that is publishing the form. Whereas in the side-by-side scenario, you are publishing the form to the SharePoint form library, and the form is performing the 2 submits. So, you know, there's a lot of pros and cons. One of the big pros of keeping it integrated in DBXL is migration, because we saw yesterday with the migration tool, you can export this doc type, and it pulls down the form, it pulls down the database mapping, it pulls down the SharePoint mapping, it pulls down all your documents, right? And you can put that on a shared drive, and you can import it into any other server that has DBXL. So migration is a breeze. When you get into the side-by-side scenario, let's say that you want to migrate, you're going to start running into some more scenarios that require you to be careful. It's not impossible, but it's just a little bit more difficult. Because any time that you open a form from SharePoint, it's going to be looking for a form in DBXL. So the migration has to be done in a way that this doc ID here, 264, still matches your doc ID 264 in DBXL. If they don't match, you're going to start running into issues. You're going to start running into duplicates or run into version conflicts. So that wraps up Module 10 of the DBXL training.